Hi, I'm Jennifer Urban from Montclair State University, and I really enjoyed your talk and your commentary. I tend to view evaluation as a process of feedback, as a continuous process, and that there's different times and places that where the kind of coaching that, as you described it, that empowerment evaluation provides, and the more focus on a independent, outcome-focused evaluation is more appropriate. And I'm curious whether you would say that, in your definition, is evaluation always about effectiveness, or is sometimes the role of evaluation to improve and to provide the capacity for organizations to actually engage in capacity building, to be able to self-improve almost before they get to the point where they're ready for a more independent evaluation? In other words, I see empowerment evaluation as a part of the process, and there's certain stages in a program's life cycle where that approach is going to be most appropriate, and a more independent evaluation would actually be inappropriate because the program is not fully developed enough in order to be prepared for a more independent, objective kind of evaluation. So I'm curious whether you see these as part of perhaps a continuum where there's an appropriate time and a place for something like an empowerment evaluation approach versus a more independent outcome evaluation.
Is this a question for both of us? Do you want to go first, Abe?
Sure. There are a lot of aspects to that. One is, and Laura Levitin's behind you and is very well known for terrific work in evaluability assessment. Is something ready to be evaluated? So I think that's an important issue. I actually view this a little bit differently. You will hear it here, you may have heard it elsewhere. Empowerment evaluation is not for every time and place. There is a time and place for it, and there's a time and place not for it. If you want to know what happened untouched by human evaluation, sometimes we need to look back and say, why did this go wrong? Why did that go wrong? The shuttle disaster, this or that. It's too late for an empowerment evaluation. You're absolutely right. What I do think, and I want to make clear, if I haven't made it clear enough, is the outcomes in empowerment evaluation are the same as the outcomes in a traditional evaluation. Empowerment evaluation is a means to an end to help people actually achieve those outcomes, because God knows we have many evaluations that have shown little, if any, results. And a lot of people are not satisfied with that. And so what we're saying is the knowledge and tools of evaluation are useful, they are important. Let's be proactive about using them. The independence issue, bring that in, is not as much of an issue. It depends what we want to know. And if independence is totally important for that, fine. But lots of times what people are after is, how do we get to a bottom line? How do we get outcomes? So I don't see it as a it can work in that phased way that you're describing, but it's not the only way that it can work. Primarily, it's about being proactive and forward-looking and trying to help people get on a path that's more likely to reach results. Is that kind of somewhere in there? I hope I answered your question.
Thanks. So I think that's a really great question, and it could well be that they're a continuum, and I think it's absolutely right that what do you want to know is kind of the guiding question. So one of the evaluations we did was of a big Institute of Health Improvement-led programme in the UK, where the IHI were commissioned by a big charity in London to put in their improvement methods into 24 hospitals throughout the UK. And it was really important there that we understood whether it was worth using that approach, whether that approach was effective, because if it was, then the plan was to roll it out to the rest of the country. Okay, so the aim there was to figure out, does this work? And if it does work, how does it work? I think empowerment evaluation bundled in with some of those improvement methods could have enhanced it, but it was absolutely critical that we did the independent evaluation and we didn't rely on the data that that the sites themselves were producing, because had we done that, we would have reached a much more optimistic view of what they were doing. We ended up doing a controlled evaluation and basically demonstrated that the controls didn't outperform the sites in the program. So therefore the decision was made not to invest further in using those methods. What I'd really like to see actually is an evaluation where you put sites with empowerment evaluation head to head with sites without. So you're doing an evaluation of evaluation methods. But I really think the more I hear about empowerment evaluation, it's an enhanced form of improvement rather than, strictly speaking, evaluation in its own right. Thanks very much.
And just one thing I want to add is if you do that, where you're going to put them head to head, I hope that you would select programs that are at varying points in their own programmatic life cycles, because my hypothesis would be that earlier programs that are newer and still have a lot of instability in them would actually do better with empowerment evaluation, and programs that are much more stable, where there's clear protocols in place, would do much better with your kind of approach. That would just be my hypothesis. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Juliana, and I work for the World Bank in Washington, D.C., where I'm responsible for energy and extractives monitoring and evaluation, and before that I worked on human development. So my job is to make sure that large infrastructure operations are outcome-based, and as you know, that's very challenging. So I'm kind of wondering if you've applied this to infrastructure-type projects, say to changing solar, installing solar, and reducing, costs of energy and stuff like that. Because I do see a role for it, for what you've described in terms of the means to the end, because we do care about how people get moved if you have large hydropower operations. I care very much about what happens in the mining area. So we do want to make sure that human lives are not impacted negatively in the process of trying to get development to people across the world. But I'm just wondering whether this is fitted more to the means to the end rather than to the end, because obviously people always ask me, how do you do impact evaluation on a large, petroleum project? How do you do, what kind of randomized trials do you do when you're trying to get electricity to people in very dark places? So I'd just like to know if you've thought about how to apply this. Say, I would see, for instance, an example in the U.S. With the initiatives to kind of have people change their, their bulbs to something that's more efficient. Do you know of if this has been applied anywhere in those kind of scenarios?
Abe?
I don't know if it's been applied in that scenario. I have been thinking a lot about what happens in the development world, and almost every time I see something, it's about how some development project did not work. It worked in this one place, and then some philanthropy gives zillions of dollars, and the money is often wasted and iatrogenic sometimes. And I will say, I look at the world through GTO, getting to outcomes lenses. When I wear glasses, they have those 10 steps. They're a way of looking at things. And the first question on needs and resources says, what do we need to do here? And not expect that every place, all disadvantaged populations in all countries are going to have the same exact problem, and one solution is going to fit all. So in that sense, I think that the kind of thinking that we're talking about can apply to what you're asking about. But I'm not aware of it happening.
The literature that would be worth looking at is Bent Freiberg from Oxford, who's done some fantastic work on why mega projects fail, and I think would be very relevant to what you're talking about.
Hi, Laura Levitin. I wanted to thank both of you. In terms of the last question, I think fit and capacity, well, actually all the steps of GTO would seem to be relevant, but in terms of culture and so forth, I would go with fit as well. I wanted to talk about something else. Many things have been said about independence and evaluation, some of them very foolish. But I think this interaction really highlights the best of the debate. So the issue before us is whether evaluation is a big tent or a slightly smaller tent, or whether there's two tents next to each other with a camel poking its nose through one. Abe is interesting, I think, to the quality improvement in medicine folks, precisely because there is some relevance or similarity. But one has to wonder about what is independence and how does it work for us. Someone else who has much to say about this, if I may, is George Grobe, who's done all sorts of things that convey independence or lack of independence. So just to make a long story short, we're talking about whether an internal evaluator is still an evaluator. I would just like to point out it's sort of like belly buttons. Is it an innie or an outie? Because you could have an external evaluator who is simply a hired gun, right? With the trappings and features of independence without the actuality. Yes, you at the Robert Wood Johnson did everything right. Congratulations to you. You know, this is miraculous. You could have an internal evaluator who is wise enough to say, the emperor has no clothes. I would refer you to the old paper by Solomon Ash on conformity. What we want is an evaluator who can pass the test of not conforming. Know the stick is exactly the same length, or whatever the particular perceptual issue might be. And I would just throw that out there. There is a good paper to be written, maybe we can all co-produce it, called The Dance of Independence. How can you have the actuality of independence and what that offers in terms of value without reference to the form that it might take? I realize, Mary, it is much more difficult when you are inside an organization, but it would be interesting to see the degree of correspondence for external evaluators and so forth. And some of them are just not very good to begin with. So whether it's an internal or an external evaluator, if the quality isn't there, you know.
Yeah. Thanks, Laura. So I'm using independent as a shorthand. I recognize there are lots of problems with it. To me, independence means that you are not responsible for the outcomes. And there are many ways in which you can achieve that. But if you are invested in the outcomes as well as determining whether you've achieved the outcomes, it does change the game. So I think having somebody who, or a team, who have to be good and have to do it authentically and not simply produce the coat of independence, that's the key. And I've now done so many of these program evaluations where the story being told internally is completely different from the story we're telling as the external people. But as I like your idea of the two tenths. I'm absolutely convinced that what Abe says is correct, that having evaluation capacity built into improvement efforts, working through a structured framework like GTO, having people who push for critical thinking, that's absolutely key. So there are roles for both.
Good morning, Lacey Fabian. So thank you for a thought-provoking discussion this morning. I actually work with MITRE on national quality measure development and implementation rollout, so we help support the contractors who are doing that. And one of the challenges is always trying to figure out how to actually incorporate the patients or the providers into the processes that are going on for the quality measure development at that national level, so policy filtering all the way down. And I like this, and I'm wondering what opportunities you see for getting that information back up to the top where the policies themselves are being implemented and rolled out and the methods are going into play, because we always want that kind of feedback, but it's really difficult to actually get it.
I guess people at lower levels need to be empowered to speak to the higher levels. So how foolish am I not to have mentioned one of Mary's studies looking at checklists and where it actually was successful in Michigan at scale. And what she found out ex post facto was social dynamics were involved, dealing with the hierarchy of a nurse stopping the surgeon from going forward. That's not an easy thing to do. Changing those dynamics so it's not just horizontal from top to bottom or nation to state to, one way is a big deal. But what needs to be realized, and it's not exactly an answer, is the interdependence, that you can't get those national level changes unless there are changes on the ground. They really need to understand how interdependent those systems are. How to encourage that is what I think of as mutual accountability. I tell funders, that unless they're actually doing the work, they're dependent on the people they give money to. They're interdependent because lots of times their funding depends on things going well. If they want to get more money, an agency wants to get more money, if it can show positive outcomes, it's more likely to be able to obtain more money. So the interdependence of those levels is key. But as always, those gray areas of overlap and interdependence are harder to describe than, just sort of do it hierarchically. So what I would say, in short, is if they really care about outcomes at that level, they're going to have to figure out how to encourage that feedback.